And this is how we've dealt with them. Again, this is our strategy exploiting it, but I'm sure there are other ways of exploiting those inefficiencies under different strategies. So the first one is the time horizon. That's the easy one. You need to have a longer horizon. How do you do it? Well, ignore short-term questions. People find this really hard, but I believe that that's the only way. If you try to say, I want to do well in the short term and in the long term, you'll fail. So you have to handicap yourself. You have to basically put yourself at what looks like a disadvantage by refusing to think about the short term. And that gives you a clearer mind to think about the long term. The second thing is a longer holding period, and that's something that you have to, again, build over time until it becomes an expectation for you. If you're managing money for others especially, that's very important because that drives their expectations, which psychologically impacts you. So once you become a fund manager that's known to have a holding period of 5 years or 6 years or 7 years, you will find that psychologically you as an investor, when you're trying to make a decision that involves a 6-month or 1 year horizon, you kind of feel something wrong because that external image of people about who your identity is, what your identity is, it starts to impact you and influence your decision, in this case in a positive way. So basically, in a sense, you're faking it until you make it, right? And the last one is selecting like-minded investors. And I think this is really hard, if you're managing money for others, especially in today's world. Because you're also running a business, right? And you want to grow and you want to make money. But I think there's a balance that you need to find. And there are many situations, especially people who end up with controlling investors, so investors who own a big chunk of their fund but have a very different perspective in terms of time horizon, where that's been the reason why they fail. And they can be silent. That's not the issue. The issue isn't that they're silent. If you know at the back of your head that their expectations are such that you have to make the money every quarter, every year, you will be biased. You will not be able to think long term if you know that the investor base is that type. The second thing is behavioral biases. Now, I think the first step in overcoming behavioral biases is admitting that no one is immune to them and trying to say, oh, well, no, I'm not going to be impacted by that. That's the first step towards failure. Everybody is impacted by behavioral biases. And the only way that we now know to work, not perfectly, but it can help, is to use tools. And so, for example, what we do when we're looking at an investment idea in our process, the first thing we do is something we call trying to kill the idea quickly. And this was born out of necessity for a while. So when I first started doing that for many years, I worked by myself and I didn't have the time to invest in researching every idea. And so for many years, I developed this habit of trying to say no, basically, as soon as possible. And not invest a lot of time in an idea and then discovering that it's not going to build up to something. But then over time I discovered that starting by your process by looking at what you don't like, looking for things that are ugly, that are bad, things that you hate, puts you in a frame of mind psychologically where it overcomes something that's known as confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is you look at something, you like it, you start trying to find the evidence that supports your first impression, basically. And eventually, you will find the data that supports reasons to buy, for example. But if you're a long-only investor, for example, and you start by using short sellers tools, looking for the things that could cause this investment to tank, then you reduce the effect of confirmation bias because you start by looking for all the reasons why you hate an idea, things that you probably will not do if you started looking at the things that you like. The second thing that we do is a checklist. And checklists are known. There's an excellent book called The Checklist Manifesto on the subject. A few others, but checklists are known as a very good tool to help deal with behavioral biases. And they've been shown for a very long time to work in aviation, but more recently they've been used in medicine, in ERs, and in other applications where they help us as human beings overcome our behavioral biases. One example of that we have, that's part of the checklist, but I have it as separately, something called the internal rules. So we have, I list a couple of rules here, things that are automatic decisions, basically, things that we will do without thinking if A, B, and C are satisfied. And one of them is called the broken thesis rule. Another rule is, so the broken thesis rule is when we buy something, we write in 3 lines why we bought that stock, for example. And we review that every quarter when the company reports. And they have to be concrete and measurable, and they have to have a deadline. And if one of them fails, then we place the stock on basically an alert. And if 2 of them fail, then we sell the stock immediately, no matter what. In fact, if 2 of them fail, we have a rule within 48 hours. If, for example, I'm not in, my assistant portfolio manager sells the position if he can't get a hold of me within 48 hours. Now, and the idea is basically we can always come back and buy the stock, but we don't want to be in a position where the stock comes down and you're trying to find reasons why you want to continue to hold. Another one that's linked to it is the add 1% or sell rule. And that's the rule, again, that we have where when we buy, we put limits on as part of our thesis of when we have to make a decision to either add 1% of our portfolio to that position or sell out completely. And that we think helps with loss aversion. So loss aversion is another behavioral bias that we have as human beings, which is basically you buy a stock for 15, goes down to 10, you tell yourself, as soon as it goes back to 15, I'm selling. And the reason that this is silly is that the stock doesn't know what you paid for it. And so there is no reason why it should go back to 15. And the most important question isn't what happened from 15 down to 10, but what's going to happen after 10. So is this stock from 10 to 15, in order for it to go from 10 to 15, you need to go up by 50%. Is this stock going to go up by 50%? Is it going to do better than every other investment opportunity out there? Forget about what happened in the past. And if it is more likely to do well, then we should be able to add 100 basis points, 1% of the portfolio to that position. If we are uncomfortable and not confident enough to add a mere 1% to the position, then that means we think we are falling to a victim to loss aversion, and it's time to sell the position completely. So that's another rule that we did to deal with our behavioral biases. And the third thing is the deterministic worldview. I mentioned that simulation. So basically think of, you could do it in scenario analysis, you could do it using Monte Carlo simulations. It doesn't really matter. What matters is you expand the range of outcomes in your head. And by exposing yourself to these outcomes very early on before you make a decision to buy something, I believe that it puts you in a better position to exploit skewed outcomes. And there are a lot of them out there that you can exploit from time to time. Most investment opportunities that do work out because they're skewed, where the odds to return ratio is messed up. And I think simulating or doing scenario analysis can show you that that's the case. And the third one is intellectual humbleness. So my colleague Aubrey came up with this term, Occam's investment. There was Occam's razor. And basically, the principle goes like this: the investment that requires the least number of assumptions is likely to be the best one. And the reason that's the case is that if you say that I can get any assumption correct 80% of the time. So anytime I look at an assumption about the future, I'm going to be right 80% of the time. That's a very high success rate. But let's say that's the case. Let's say you're really good and you think you're going to be right 80% of the time. Well, every time you add an assumption, the second assumption is also 80% of the time. Multiply it by the first, multiply it by the third, the fourth. By the time you get to 4 assumptions, you're down to 40%. By the time you get to 10 assumptions, you're down to approximately 10%. So every assumption that you add reduces the odds that you're going to be correct. And so in order to increase the odds, you basically, if you look at it, basically you're talking about 3 assumptions. Anything below 3 assumptions in this case, you're already flipping a coin. And so have the intellectual humbleness to know that you're not going to be able to predict all these variables in your fancy Excel model for the next 10 years or